What exactly is MotoGP and why does it matter? I mean, you may not have had any desire to race, so what could you possibly learn from watching racing? So today, I'm gonna get you up to speed on MotoGP so you can start enjoying the sport straight away. And by straight away, the 2025 racing season starts like now. This is prototype racing. Each bike is handmade from the ground up. You couldn't buy one if you wanted. Even if you had the $2 million in cash, these bikes are estimated to cost. This is the Formula One of motorcycles, but it is so much more exciting and interesting to watch. And I'm going to explain why and why that matters here in a minute. So let's talk about these prototype bikes for a second. They are 1000cc naturally aspirated engines, which means no turbos or superchargers. But the bikes make upwards of 300 horsepower with no rule saying what the max power can be. But you only get a few motors to last you the entire season. You don't get to rebuild them. If they blow up, that's it for that motor. But to give you perspective as to how powerful a MotoGP bike is, let's look at power to weight ratio. The average supercar has about 500 horsepower per ton. An F1 car has about 1200 horsepower per ton. That's a lot. But the power to weight ratio of a MotoGP bike would be almost 2000 horsepower per ton. That's insane, right? Now you'll notice the bikes look really odd, not especially pretty with all those wings and weird shapes. And the Aero is pretty controversial because it creates some scary turbulence in the straightaway. But despite that, the wings are pretty fascinating because they cannot move. So instead, they move the whole bike. They have what's called a ride height device. It raises and lowers the rear end of the bike. Basically, the bikes transform to become drag bikes as they come out of the corner. The rear end lowers, and that changes the angle of the wings, so they produce very little drag. And then as they come to the corner, the rear end will come back up, and the wings start producing drag and downforce, pushing the front of the bike back down into the ground. And they say the downforce is so powerful that riders are entering corners with little to no front brake pressure, depending on the corner. The wings are doing all of that work. The weird wings on the tail work just like on a car. They try to put more load into the rear tire and keep the back wheel on the ground, as well as they help the bike corner when the bike is leaned over and the rider is hanging off the bike. But here's where MotoGP starts to get really interesting. Unlike a car, everything on the bike is affected by the rider. How they sit on the bike or hang off affects the aero package and changes how the bike behaves. It changes the weight distribution. Unlike car racing, where we may only see the top of the helmets bobbing about, we get to watch the riders try to manhandle and fight to get around the track. What are they doing with their hands or feet or elbows is out in the open for all of us to see and marvel at. And where car racing, the car is maybe 80% of the equation, motorcycle racing is the opposite. 80% or more comes down to the rider. And that's never more evident than when it comes to crashes. The stakes feel very real. And when a rider you're following crashes, you're literally watching in horror, hoping that they'll be okay. The other thing is that all the bikes are running the same ECU and the same tire. These spec components are used to level the playing field and make for closer racing. I mean, compared to even World Superbike, the ECU isn't very sophisticated, and they only get a very small allocation of soft or hard compound tires to last the entire weekend. And then the other thing about the tires has been the rear tire is phenomenally capable, while the front tire is notoriously bad. And this has affected how the bikes have been designed. They're designed to put more weight on the rear tire, and they're doing more braking with the rear and all sorts of cool stuff. Meanwhile, the front tire is having all these problems. So teams are penalized if the front tire pressure is outside of Michelin's recommended range. I mean, the riders have a little light on their dashboard that lights up if the front tire gets too hot, and then they need to back off and let the tire cool down. Now let's talk about the teams for a second. You have factory teams, which, as you would expect, are sponsored by the factory. And then you have satellite teams, which are primarily sponsored by a third party. But each factory supplies one satellite team with bikes, with the exception of Ducati, who supplies 2 satellite teams. And this has been a significant part of Ducati's dominance over the past few years, because they get more data to help them with their bike setup and get the bikes dialed in faster at each new track. Now, also, each team has 2 riders. But unlike every other sport in the world, your teammate is not your buddy. This is the first person you want to be faster than. You need to beat your teammate more than anybody else on the grid to prove your value, because he's the only other person on the same equipment as you are. And some of the greatest rivalries this sport has ever seen has actually been between teammates. One of the challenges to understanding MotoGP is the race weekend can be kind of confusing, especially because of qualifying. There's 2 qualifying sessions as well as 2 races every weekend. So there's 2 sessions on Friday. The first session on Friday morning is nothing more than practice, and they use it to get the bike set up for the track. But the second session is like a pre-qualifier. So bear with me here. So when it comes to qualifying, the racers are split into 2 groups. The slowest half goes into Q1, and then the 2 fastest riders in Q1 get to move into Q2. So you desperately want to go straight into Q2. A rider who goes into Q1 and makes it into Q2 likely won't have the time or the tires to get a good grid position if they have to fight their way out of Q1. So that means the last 10 or 15 minutes of the second practice session on Friday can be really exciting, because everyone is challenging and fighting for those top 10 spots so they can go straight into Q2. And then when it comes to qualifying, the qualifying actually takes place on Saturday afternoon, and depending on the weekend, Q2 can be as good as any race. And then we get to the races. There's 2. Saturday is a sprint race. It's half the distance with half the points, and only the top half of the field get any points. Only the top 9 riders get points. The main event isn't until Sunday. So that means that each race, Saturday or Sunday, has a very different flavor. The half-distance sprint race on Saturday allows riders to run a softer tire, a lower fuel load, and it can be an aggressive race. And because the stakes are lower, different riders on smaller teams have an opportunity to shine. But then the main event is the story. It's the grand epic of the year. It's where all the strategy and drama unfolds. But this setup means that there's something exciting to watch each day. Friday with basically the pre-qualifying, Saturday with the actual qualifying and the sprint race, and then the main event on Sunday. And I love to watch all the practice sessions, but I'm gonna explain why here in a second. So which riders should you pay attention to? MotoGP is this big epic every summer, and I personally root for different riders and different teams for different reasons. I'm kind of rooting for everybody all the time. But I'm not gonna go through the whole roster. That would be overwhelming. I am going to give you some highlights so you know who to pay attention to right off the bat. Marc Marquez, arguably one of the greatest talents the sport has ever seen, right up there with Valentino Rossi. He's charming and brash and polarizing because his riding can be so aggressive that it often results in dramatic crashes. He won 5 world titles on the Honda, but with Honda's recent bike problems, he left his contract early under a heavy penalty, and this year will be on a factory Ducati. And the Ducatis have been unstoppably dominant the last 3 years. His teammate is Pecco Bagnaia. He won the title for Ducati in 2022 and 2023. Pecco is a gentleman rider, but often his own worst enemy, crashing out for simple mistakes. This year, the world is expecting a lot of drama between him and his teammate, Marquez. Now, the factory Ducati has been unstoppable, mostly because of how strong the motor is. It's incredibly powerful, but the bike itself is not especially nimble. The team manager, Gigi Dall'Igna, he built the bike specifically to exploit the Michelin rear tire. So that means every other manufacturer is playing catch up to Ducati. And then there's last year's title winner, Jorge Martin. He won the championship on a satellite Ducati. It's the first satellite team to win a title in like forever. But Ducati picked Marquez for the second Ducati factory bike instead of the championship winning Martin. So Martin is going to the factory Aprilia. So for sure, I think there's going to be some hard feelings there, and I expect Martin's going to be riding with a lot to prove. Now, the Aprilia is recognized as probably the most balanced bike on the grid, leading many to think that it's probably the only other bike that can actually challenge Ducati's dominance. And I think Martin is probably their best chance to prove how good that bike is. However, Martin had a big crash during winter testing and is starting the season off with some not insignificant injuries. Now there's Pedro Acosta, last year's Rookie of the Year, but he's on the KTM. And as of this recording, I still don't know KTM's fate. Acosta has the raw talent and racecraft to be the next GOAT, greatest of all time. But if the accountants decide not to let KTM race, where he ends up, nobody knows. Acosta is already doing things on a motorcycle that nobody has done before. So no matter what, you want to keep an eye on Acosta. Yamaha went from absolute dominance to really struggling. It's the only bike on the grid not running a V4, although we may see their in-development V4 show up sometime this year. But the wide inline-4 engine is part of their struggle. A wider engine is more wind resistance on the straightaways. Their star rider, Fabio Quartararo, was the last to win a title before Ducati's dominance set in. So far, Honda is in a hopeless spot. From being the most dominant force in motorcycle racing for the history of the world, they're now basically a backmarker. The bike is the hardest bike on the grid to ride because of how unforgiving the chassis is. So despite a cadre of extremely talented riders, expect to see the Honda to continue to struggle with a lot of crashes this year. No matter what you ride, paying attention to racing will help you understand this sport better. Despite how much we just love this sport, there isn't a lot of money in it. Nobody is doing big research projects or collecting scientific evidence. Our understanding comes mostly from racing. That means racing is our scientific evidence. It's the closest thing we have to something measurable and repeatable. I love MotoGP because I can see what the riders are doing, how they are sitting on the bike, and how they're going to the brakes. And there's these graphic overlays that show us exactly how they're going to the controls and using them. It's super cool stuff. Now, for the argument that you shouldn't ride on the road like a racer, yes, 100%. But that's not what we're looking to emulate. We look at what the best riders in the world who aren't crashing are doing, and we pay attention to that. And specifically, this is why I watch all the practice sessions. When the pressure to pass and block other riders from passing is removed, and the riders are just focusing on going as fast as they can without falling. How do they do it? You see, racing, going as fast as possible, they're riding at the absolute limits of grip. They're on the edge of traction into and out of every corner. So that means high speed teaches a lot about low grip and the need to treat them the same way, right? We can use the same basic techniques that these superheroes are using, not to go near as fast as they go, but at our much slower, sane speed to reduce our risk. And then on top of all of that, it's just a hell of a lot of fun to watch. And honestly, the best way to get into this sport is to just start watching it. So who are your favorite MotoGP heroes? Who are you rooting for this year? Let me know in the comments. Oh, right, I almost forgot. There's also a MotoGP Fantasy League where you can join the Canyon Chasers MotoGP League at fantasy.motogp.com using this code. Also, don't forget to join in the fun on our Discord server where we discuss and share our team picks and predictions and all of that. Thank you so much for watching. Ride on and ride well.